Okay, so we are talking about PL SQL, which is actually a new unit. It's actually like the third unit coming from DML, I mean not DML, but coming from data modeling, then SQL, and then here we had PL SQL. Now, what you will realize is that you cannot actually work with PL SQL without doing SQL. Of course, doing like DM or data modeling is not a must for you to tackle PL SQL. But again, it's so helpful because it will help you during your projects, especially when we will talk about something called the Oracle Forms and Reports or the Application Express. But in this case, SQL as a language is an essential factor when it comes to understanding these other technologies that comes after. So for you to become a database administrator, you must have information, or you must have the full knowledge of SQL. And of course, I know that there are some topics or some few things that we did not do it in SQL, which of course it's coming up in database administration 1, especially when we talk about database workshop. So most of those things were a little bit more, complex somehow, but we will talk about them as we proceed. So, so today we're going to start working with PL SQL. And when it comes to PL SQL, this one is just, we can talk about it or define it as a programming language attached to Oracle database, but not necessarily a programming language. We can actually give it as programming language in quotes. It's not really a programming language, but in actual sense, it actually stands for procedural language, then extension for SQL. Now, somebody can actually use PL as programming language, but the difference between a programming language and probably this particular language is that usually a programming language is a standalone language. That means you're able to develop an application from scratch using that particular language to its deployment. You see, all those stages of building an application. So if you're able to use that particular language from scratch without inviting other third-party languages or other-party tools, then that serves as a programming language. But for PL SQL, it's not a programming language, like a fully fledged programming language, but it's a programming language or a more of programming language attached to Oracle technologies or Oracle applications. Because you will realize that if we are to create an application using Oracle database, whether it's a management system, either as a student management system or hospital management system, or even airline management system, or any idea you have of a system, using Oracle technologies, you will actually end up using PL SQL. So in this case, you will find that when it comes to applying this language, we have to follow some certain rules. And following these rules, we have to include SQL. So in other words, since we have the word, the initial SQL in PL SQL, this means that the SQL plays a major role. Why? Because SQL is embedded. Usually SQL is embedded in PL SQL. So we must have the knowledge of SQL in PL SQL. So the only thing that PL SQL does is just to provide us like a framework where we can apply our SQL code. So it's very important for us to understand what PL SQL is, at the same time how what it does, and then of course how we can apply it. So we are going to start it from a more simple environment, just to start from what is it in the first place, and of course, how do we declare PL SQL codes? Now, if you remember very well that in SQL, we talked about sample schemas, a sample schema or a sample database schema. For example, we had HR. So HR is very, very important because as long as, apart from other schemas that we have, we have this, we have the provision of HR as a database for us to work on. And if we can create our own tables, we can create our own databases or our own user accounts, it's also well and good. It doesn't mean that we have to stick only to HR, but since HR is there, we can actually use that as a good practice in ensuring that we understand what we understand. We understand PL SQL. So in this case, HR is there for us to work on. And when it comes to, let's say, PL SQL, you see, we have to understand some concepts of coding. Like here, coding is also like plays like an integral point in understanding, because we will actually get to try to code. So if you guys are having like a passion of coding or just programming in future, or you had already done some bit of programming, then I think this one is also like a way to at least test some coding. So we are going to write some PL SQL code, which of course act like the back end of these applications. You see, at the end of, let's say, midway within our course, we will be required to probably come up with some systems or projects. And based on these projects, the back end of these projects, would automatically end up at us applying the PL SQL language. So so what happens is, when it comes to having this language, or applying this language, we need again to have like a good understanding of other technologies, and this makes it easy for us to apply. So so when it comes to now PL SQL, apart from writing PL SQL code to interface with the database, because we will connect with the database, we will also be required to also understand the blocks. We have something called the PL SQL blocks, and these PL SQL blocks are actually in 3 forms, so we will get to understand them. We will also be required to understand PL SQL programming constructs, something called programming constructs, and again, the conditional statements, which of course is almost the same thing that other programming languages have. So it's like understanding the syntax, the way these languages are structured, the way the conditional expressions have to be performed, and how they are executed. And again, in PL SQL, we'll also understand how can we handle errors. These errors, remember, they are runtime errors. And when we talk about runtime errors, what we mean is that how do we experience errors that comes immediately we execute our code? Or how can we capture the errors that comes immediately after we press the enter keyword in our keyboard? So we need again to understand handle runtime errors. And if I can talk about something in handling these runtime errors, imagine you creating a system, and this system is to be used by Mama Mboga. Let's assume you're coming up with a system used by Mama Mboga as a database management system. And at some point, if this Mama Mboga actually uses or tries even to enter some data, and then he experiences some errors, you see, those errors can come up, or these errors can pop up in a language which is not understandable, or language which is more complex for Mama Mboga to understand. And if you remember that, of course, we've experienced some errors coming from SQL, that they are usually given in codes like ora-00, you see. So those types of language, or those types of error display, we need to devise a way on how they can be understood by any application user. So that is what we mean by handling errors. So we will actually talk about how do we handle runtime errors. And of course, we will also get to understand some few concepts about something called the SAP programs. That means we will be able or will be in a position to create procedures. How do we create procedures? How do we create functions? How do we create triggers? How do we create, so they are actually referred to as sub-programs. So we will actually be in a position to create these procedures, functions, triggers, and so many other things. So it's actually a very important course for us, and in as far as development is concerned. Remember, you guys will end up probably becoming like a functional consultant, a technical consultant, a DBA, that is database administrator. You become a developer. You see, all this would come in handy when we apply or when we have a good knowledge of PL SQL. Remember, for you to become a developer, this is what we need. This is the PL SQL. And of course, inside PL SQL, we also need to use SQL. So the only thing remaining after this for you to become a fully fledged developer, database developer, is now to create, how do we create the interface, or how do we create now the front end? I know we've heard of front end and back end. So by doing PL SQL here, we are understanding the back end of an application. We are understanding the back end of an application. Now, so I think that is just but a brief description on what we anticipate, what we expect or expected to have. And yeah. Now, again, remember, we will still be using the same SQL Plus as a tool. And of course, we will also talk about the Oracle SQL Developer. I know probably some of us are unable to access SQL Developer. Some of us are able to access. But at the end, we will be able to apply or to actually use the Oracle SQL Developer at the same time SQL Plus. Now, the two are same, no differences. It's only that the only difference, SQL Developer will only provide you with the graphical user interface. It's more of images, and that again, I think it can give you like a smooth flow of information. But again, we have SQL, which is more of command line. So for that, you will only interact with the black screen, just the same way I have it. So the Oracle SQL Developer is just like a free graphical tool that enhances productivity and simplifies database development tasks. And we can only connect to any target. Target means if your database, if I ask you now to give me the database name, you can give me as ORCL. Somebody else can give me as ORCL1 or ORCL2. That qualifies, that summarizes what we refer to as the Oracle or the target Oracle database. So the target database will always be represented by the SID or the system ID name. So, and of course, you'll be required to provide the authentications for you to get in. So that is what we referred by that. Now, so if we can start by probably talking about, now probably something else before we look at what we need to talk about. We also have like an introduction to Oracle Cloud, if you remember. So when it comes to cloud, you see, this is like we are being provided with the virtual storage areas where we can push our data. And that is like a new application or a new technology that has actually come. And most of the companies are now moving their storage to cloud. And this is the reason. For example, if you look at, for example, a huge company, let's say, for example, Facebook, you see, without, before the inception of the Oracle, not the Oracle Cloud, but cloud computing, you see, a company like that had to store their data in servers, the physical server machines. So imagine the number of data that they're receiving every day. That tells you that they had to invest a lot of money in buying the physical server machines to store this particular data. And thanks to what? Thanks to the cloud computing, because there was this introduction of the cloud, like a virtual storage area, which was actually called a cloud. where people can now reduce the number of physical server machines and have more of what? Storage in the cloud. Of course, people shifting to this cloud thing, you see, first of all, they have to consider the security of their data. So if security of their data is a little bit low, or if they saw a need that we need to shift to the cloud or to remain in our premises, then it's actually up to them. Because imagine you are using, like, you are storing your data in the physical server machines, and then this technology came, and then someone is convincing you that, yeah, just push your data into the cloud, it will be safe. So for that, it will be a little bit difficult for you to capture that info or capture that information that, yes, I need to shift. So you cannot, it's not something that you will invite it, or an idea that will invite it and make a difference or make an effort to push your data. You have to look, first of all, how the security is. So in this case, it means that it actually started, especially in Oracle. You see, we had earlier versions of the Oracle database, like 11G. 11G was based on storing their data in the Oracle server machines, that is the physical server machines. But in this case, introduction of 12C, you see C for cloud, that now tells us that there was now it had the ability to store now the data in the cloud because it's already integrated with what? With the cloud. So just to know that we have something called the Oracle Cloud, and this Oracle Cloud is an enterprise cloud for business. That means that it consists of different services. If you're to go with the cloud, it consists of different services, which includes like on-demand self-service. That means you're able to access the cloud, try to capture one or two, any service that you like. We also have like resource pooling, where different people or different resources have been pushed into the cloud for clients to access them. We also have like broad network access and so many other advantages over the cloud. So I think that is something that we need also to get to understand how it is. Now, talking about, I think there was something else about, let's say, like types of cloud deployments or which models. You see, if you're to get into the cloud, probably you want to get into your own private cloud. You want to concentrate or create your own private cloud. So for private cloud, this is only exclusive by a single organization. A single organization, and this cloud can, since it's being manned by a single organization, it can be controlled, it can be managed, and then of course it can be hosted in a private data center. So this one is private. We have one for public, where we have multiple organizations coming in. We also have community cloud, which can be used by a group of related organizations. And then of course we have the hybrid cloud, which can actually lead to integration of both the private cloud and the public cloud. So I think we will talk much about the cloud. And I know if you had gone through the document, I think we had such examples. Now, let me introduce PL SQL now. So when it comes to introduction of PL SQL, we are looking at, first of all, explaining the importance or explaining the need. Why should we have PL SQL in the first place? And then, of course, what are the benefits of having this PL SQL? And then what are different types of PL SQL blocks that are there? And of course, I'll show you how can we output messages in PL SQL. So this is very important. This is very important. And the first thing we can say as far as about PL SQL, we already said that it stands for procedural language extension to SQL. PL SQL, again, as part of the Oracle Corporation's product, we can say that is an Oracle Corporation's standard data access language for relational databases. That means if you want to work with relational databases, of course, if you're to learn or understand PL SQL, already you're working with the relational databases. Relational databases in this case means that these are databases that stores their data in tables, and you can actually again integrate the SQL. Remember I say that SQL is embedded in PL SQL. That means you have SQL inside PL SQL. You have SQL inside PL SQL. And SQL being the primary language for accessing and modifying data in relational databases, that makes it more simple for you to apply in PL SQL. So about PL SQL again, there's this provision of PL SQL blocks, or we have the provision of block structure, or PL SQL has provided us with the block structures, which we can use to execute this code. So when it comes to the structure, I'm going to share like 3 types of structure. And by having this block, it makes it easier for us to maintain our code more easier, and again to define the structure of our code or our PL SQL block more easier. Now, what PL SQL block entails, it entails things like variables. I think we talked about in PL SQL, in SQL, it entails things like variables, it entails things like constants, it entails things like data types. So we are not left out. We are not left out with the data types, with the variables. We also have like the control structures. That means in that particular block, if you want to embed SQL, we also have the option of embedding. That means embedding means putting in between. So we can put in between variables, constants, data types. We can put in between control structures. That means we will talk about conditional statements and even the loops, if you ever encountered with any programming language. And then of course, we will talk about programs that can be reused and programs that can be reused and programs that cannot be reused more than once. So we will talk about them as we move forward. So in the case of defining a block structure for writing code, PL SQL is there to provide us with that. Now, again, PL SQL block, you see like PL SQL block, we have to execute these PL SQL blocks or PL SQL blocks in SQL terminal or in SQL as a tool. So then we have a process. I know that up to where we are nowadays or where we are today, we've been interacting with SQL Plus, but we've not actually looked beyond the execution of that code. What happens after the code has been executed? So you see, especially the PL SQL, and of course, as we advance to database workshop 1, we will also understand more about the database architecture. That is the memory, the background processes, the database storage structures. We will get to understand them more. But in this case, once you write the PL SQL code, it will be channeled. Your code will be channeled to something called the PL SQL engine. And the PL SQL engine will communicate with the Oracle server for the SQL statement to be executed. And then the statement is brought back to the terminal for review. So these things actually takes up like, it's an instant thing. It's not like something that will take time for you to understand. So what happens is, what are the benefits of PL SQL? This is more theoretically. Benefits of PL SQL, if you can say, one, in terms of performance, it actually do some, like it improves some performance in query execution. It's more faster. Again, with PL SQL, you can integrate SQL in PL SQL. That is another advantage. Another advantage, again, it's portability. It's portability. That means if you're able to remember, PL SQL already is integrated in Oracle database. So once you have that software, already PL SQL is there. It's only that you are not able to access or you're not able to use it, but it's always there. So when we talk about portability, when we talk about portability, it means that with Oracle software being installed in Windows operating system, you can have PL SQL in there. With Oracle database software being installed in Linux operating system, you can still have PL SQL there. If let's say the Oracle database software is installed in Mac laptops, you can still have what? You can still have PL SQL in there. Another advantage or another benefit of having PL SQL is exception handling. That means you're able to handle errors. Remember, we had a point about how can we handle how can we handle errors in PL SQL, especially runtime errors. So we can actually use PL SQL to do that. We can also integrate PL SQL with Oracle tools. That means we can actually connect PL SQL with another Oracle tool such as Oracle Forms and Reports, or even the Application Express, that is the Apex for development. So you can extend that just the same way we've integrated SQL with PL SQL. We can still integrate PL SQL with what? With Oracle Forms and other technologies. So in this case, it's more important to understand PL SQL at its inception, and so that as we progress, we will be able to know. Now, there's something now I want us to do, and I think we'll just adjust the, let me just push it to 28 so that you can see it fully. Now, when it comes to the PL SQL block structure, the PL SQL block structure, PL block structure always have like 4 sections. Out of the 4 sections, 2 sections are mandatory, 2 sections are optional. So it's either you use them or not use them. For example, we have the declaration, the declare part. Declare part, this one is optional. We also have the begin. Begin part, this one is mandatory. I want you to write that. Like, we also have the exception. This one is optional. It's not a must for you to have it, but it depends. What are you executing? And then we have the end. The end, this one is mandatory. You see? So this is how PL SQL block should look like. It must have like 4 of these. Declare, begin, exception, and end. Now, the reason why I'm saying some are optional, some are mandatory. For the optional points or optional sections, these are sections whether we can do them without, based on what we are doing. But we will be forced at some point, especially the declare. We will be using declare most of the time, but it will reach a point where we can make it an optional. But what we cannot avoid it, as far as executing PL SQL code, is begin and end. So we have exception. Remember, we talked about handling runtime errors or handling exception handling. Exception is another word for errors. So if you encounter this word, it means what? It means errors. So exception, this is an area where we are able to capture errors. We're able to capture errors. So we have exception, then we have end. End as mandatory, exception as optional, begin as mandatory, declare as optional. So we will talk about this and just know how simple they are or how simple it has to be. And I think I'll show you how it is. So when it comes to having declare, what should come in the declaration section? Now, declare means declare, like you have to name. What are we naming? If you're to declare a variable, you're supposed to declare within the declaration section. Declare cursors, declare user-defined exceptions, which means, of course, we'll talk about the errors, but that will come. The user-defined exceptions we will talk about after. I think it's around chapter 7. But for variables, this is exactly what you're going to start with. For the begin, which is mandatory section, that section will always contain SQL statements or PL SQL statements, the way you want. So that is the main part where we have the execution points of our codes. Then we have the exception, which is optional. The exception is optional because this is where we can perform some actions that are attached to errors. If we want to give a specific name to an error or just write a message that is well understood by any Oracle application user, we will always define them within the exception. And then the last point or the last section is end section. So end section must always have what? Must always have a semicolon, must always have a semicolon, just like that, just like that, just like that. So in this case, at some point, if you're to bring in, let's say you want to bring in, let's say you want to take up the initiative of just getting rid of the optional sections. You can start with your code begin and just do what? Just end. And something else, if you want to execute your code, because after writing your PL SQL up to this point, your code is not yet executed. But for you to execute your code, you're supposed to put a /. That's why you see me putting / here, and then it brings me all these errors. Just because the code, my code or my PL SQL code is block is not complete in the first place, because I was just giving you some reference. And here again, we do not have any what? I mean, we don't have any information that comes or that makes the PL SQL block more functional. So here it means that if I have to press enter, that means that I am executing this code, but again, it's going to give me a lot of errors. So if I press enter, you can see it's giving me a lot of errors. Now, after understanding the PL SQL block structure, we need now to understand how do we examine this PL SQL block. Now, in PL SQL block, we have something called, let's say, types of what? Type of PL SQL blocks. Types of PL SQL blocks. Number one, we have something called anonymous block. Number two, we have something called procedure. Number three, we have something called functions. Now, just to know this, number 2 and 3 have a name. The name is named PL SQL block. Now, anonymous block does not have a name. Anonymous block does not have a name. So it means that if the code is executed once, you cannot recall it. What happens is you have to execute the whole code again for you to get the results. But for procedure and functions, procedures automatically must have a name. We must have a procedure name. We must have a function name. And these are referred to as named PL SQL blocks because a name must be attached to them. Again, you'll also hear me talking about subprograms. So subprograms is a combination of procedure and functions. So when you have procedure and functions together, you can call them subprograms. But when it comes to types of PL SQL blocks, you can just talk about anonymous block and named PL SQL block or named blocks. But just to know that named blocks are only two, like procedure functions that captures that particular name. So in this case, when it comes to the syntax of an anonymous block, we are supposed to have it as declare, we are supposed to have it as begin, and we are supposed to have it as end. You see, this is an example of writing a what? An anonymous block. So it will give me an error if I press enter because nothing is still, the block is not yet functional. So this is just but the syntax of anonymous block. Now you see, within these sections, we don't have anywhere that tells us that we give a name to this particular block. It's all about declaring. What are you declaring? I'm declaring a variable. I'm declaring a constant. Begin. What am I executing? So you have to talk about, is it a SQL statement or PL SQL statement? And then you end. Now, let's see for the anonymous. Let's see for the, and I mean, not anonymous, but for procedure. So for procedure, it means that you have to talk about, first of all, talk about procedure. And then here you will be required to have the procedure name. You see, of course, we will have this. When creating, we will talk about create or replace. Procedure. To create or replace procedure. And then we will have is, then we'll have begin. Of course, the statements will come in here. These are the statements. And then lastly, we'll have end. And then you put that. So you see, we have to talk about procedure, then the procedure name. Whether you call it Sammy as your procedure name, call it Mike, call it whatever. But for procedure, you have to give a name. And the only similar or common thing between a procedure and an anonymous block is the begin and end section. It will be equal to that. So when it comes to the procedure, we will get to understand more about the procedure. Now I'm getting an error there because it's not complete. That is just but a syntax. Now the function is the same again. So function, you can just have again create or replace. Function, then function name. And then you can just have return. Then you have to provide data type, return data type. Return data type. Then is, and then again you have what? The same story, statement, and then end, and then put that. So this is another, this is another subprogram or another block, which is actually like a function block. So you can see me putting create or replace. This means that whenever you are creating a procedure or a function, you are supposed to have create or replace. But you can still only use what? Create procedure, create function. Now, the reason why we're putting or replace, it means that if the same procedure, if a procedure with the same name exists, then it's meant to be replaced by the new word, by the new procedure, because you don't know. Probably another procedure exists. So if it exists, it will be replaced. Then if it does not exist, it will be created. So this is just but how these procedures, these blocks, the 3 PL SQL blocks and the 3 main PL SQL blocks. So we have anonymous block, which means that it doesn't have a name. We have procedure, which means that a name must be attached to a procedure. We also have function, which means that the name must be attached to a function. So the only difference is that when executing or when using function created and procedure created, the only thing you have to do is just call its name. Just call the name of the procedure or the function, and the code will be executed. But for the anonymous block, you have to execute the whole code once again for the second code to be executed. So we will get to know more about this, and it's a good thing for us to like work hand in hand as we get to know more about these procedures. So the common thing again about all of them is that they use the SQL PL SQL. You'll find SQL PL SQL coming in between. So that brings us to probably execute one code. And for us to execute this so that I can show you how it is being done, let me just scroll it up. So we all know that we have this term called a variable. And when you talk about a variable is a temporary. Remember, we have a temporary container. It's just a temporary container to hold the values. So it's like a temporary point where values can be captured temporarily. So it's a temporary container that hold values. So how do we create these variables? Now, let me just show you. Select, or even before this, if we want to get the output, first of all, let me show you like two output generators. We have like two output generators. So I can call it PL SQL output generators. How do we get the output? How do we get the output in PL SQL? How do we get the output in PL SQL? Number one, before you write any PL SQL block, you have to set this. Set server output on. This should be your number one word. This should be your number one. Set is one word. Server output is one word, and then on. Then we have to get used to this again. DBMS underscore output dot put underscore line into bracket. You see, this is another one. So it means that before you type in any PL SQL block, you're supposed to start with what? Set server output on. Now the question here probably is that probably someone like Robert is yet almost to query or to ask is that how many times are we supposed to key in set server output on? Is it only once for the entire session we are connected to the terminal, or is it after every anytime we want to write PL SQL block? So for this one, it means that once you set it, it's done as long as you are active in that session. But if you close your terminal and then restart it again, you will be requested or forced to have that. Now, again, probably another question is that what happens if I forgot to set server output on first before typing block? So that does not cause any harm. You can even query the block and then you execute it. Once you execute the code, you may realize that no output has been given out. So what you do is just set server output on from that point and then put a / and then the code will be run. So it means that set server output on should be is outside. You're supposed to execute it independently. But for DBMS underscore output dot put underscore line, you're supposed to execute it within the begin and end. So what happens is I will use both of them. So number one, I'll just set server output on. Press enter. You see, set server output on. So now it's like I want to communicate with the Oracle server through the PL SQL engine. Now, here, if I just have select, let's say select first name. I want to select first name. so that you can see the similarity. From employees, where employee ID equals to 100. You see, I'm getting who? I'm getting Stephen. I'm getting Stephen. Now, can we get the same results using PL SQL? So this one is purely SQL. So by getting the same results, what I have to do is I have to type what? Declare. I have to type declare and then create a variable. Now, creation of a variable depends, because the variable I want to capture, or the output I want to capture, is only the first name. I want to get the first name. So what I will do is I will create a variable called fname, v_fname. Now, when it comes to these variables, we usually attach them with like v for variable. So this does not mean that it's a must for you to put v. No, I can have even a variable as what? vfname. I can have a variable as fname. I can have a variable as fn. But as long as I know that whatever thing I'm putting here should at least remind me that I'm talking about what? First name. So what I will do is I will have fname. And then what is fname? Which data type does it work in? Is actually the varchar2. So I'll just use like varchar2 and then put 20 and then put semicolon. Now, remember, this one is a variable, and we define a variable as a temporary container. So it means that this variable will capture the first name. And then with the help of the output generator, which is dbms_output.put_line, we will end up getting the output. So I am done declaring the variable. Within what? Within the declaration point. Now, this means that I am only interested at finding the first name. What happens if I want to find first name, last name, and salary? I have to create the variable for first name. I have to create the variable for salary. I will have to create the variable for last name. So just to keep the simplicity, let's just now start the execution point. Begin. Press enter. And then I will just say select first_name into fname. You see, now I am capturing the first name, and then I am putting into my temporary container, which is called fname. Then from employees, where employee_ID equals to 100. Press enter. Then I will use the dbms, so dbms output dot put_line into bracket fname. You see where fname is coming from now. So this will help me to display the contents of this particular variable, because I am not able to get directly from the database now. So the system has to first of all capture the first name and put where? Put into the temporary container for me to capture the output. So for my case, I'll be in a position now to capture the output from the variable. And then we are done. So the last point is end with the semicolon. Don't forget that. And then /. So / means it is the last point for the code to be executed. So you can see that within the begin and end section, we have some information coming in here. And then within the declaration section, we have some information coming here. We will still improve this, like break the complexity until we understand. Now, let me press enter and see what is the results. Look at that, Stephen, I'm getting Stephen. And now I'm getting the results. PL SQL procedure successfully completed. Now, these two, is not even these two, Stephen is the result. We're getting Stephen because of what? Because of us setting this server output on. We're getting Stephen because our server is already up and running. So we are able to see Stephen. At some point, without executing this, you will not see Stephen, but you will see PL SQL procedure successfully completed. But once you set it to this, then you have it as that. So that is just but introduction to PL SQL. And it's not hard. Everything I'm going to probably lay it down for you as we move forward. Now, any question up to there? Brian, any question? Fred, Alex, Robert, Daniel? Yeah, good evening, Fred. Yeah. Okay, no problem. But I think I've recorded, so I'm going to push it so that you can also see it here where we started. Yeah, so I think let me push it, just reserve, yes. Okay.